It's really nice to have people come visit us here. I think this is actually the first SMAC meeting we've held in this building. This is a relatively new building, Davis Hall, named after Donald W. Davis, who was, in fact, the originator of BIMS. When BIMS first came to life, it was actually in a little building over on that side of the river. Donald Davis was a professor at William and Mary. That's how the Virginia Fisheries Laboratory started nearly 80 years ago before it came over here. So this building was named after him. You're in the Owens Bryant room. Two long-term supporters of our institution were very generous in sort of helping to put together this building. It is sort of one of those interesting experiments in and of itself, in that this is one of those ones that's got a green certification for being energy efficient, which sort of is surprising if you sort of look at all the glass that's in it. It is actually a heck of a lot more efficient than my house. It's an interesting building because within it, behind the wall on that end, is the entire institution computing facility, which is just something that's marvelous. And in fact, it's where all the data that we collect is currently housed somewhere in that. Down here we have meeting space. It's used by lots of groups, not only just BIMS groups, but off-campus groups as well. Upstairs, all the way along there, for those of you who's ever suffered through many BMRC meetings, that's where all of the Center for Coastal Resources Management is. All the shoreline stuff that you've been watching for the last 30 or 40 years is all up there. That's where all the people go. And that end of the building, upstairs, is all our marine extension. This is the stuff many of you have been around for a while. Remember Bill DePaul? This is where Mike Hosteling, he was part of that group. Both of them are retired now, but at this point in time, those of you who work in aquaculture, Karen Hudson lives up there, and all of our offshore scallop program is up there as well. So you are still literally sitting under a lot of management and fisheries stuff at this point in time. But anyway, good to have you here. I hope it'll be a productive meeting. I'll give it back to Andrew.
Well, thanks again to our colleagues at BIMS for hosting. I guess I think don't know if Wayne France is going to make it today, so I think I'll turn it over to JC just to go through the first two agenda items, and I'll kind of introduce the rest of the agenda after that. Does that work for you, JC? You should be able to talk from there if you want. I think it's all mic'd up, but either way, whatever you're comfortable with. So.
Okay. All right, well, thanks everybody for coming today. Glad to see everyone. Welcome y'all to the Shellfish Management Advisory Committee meeting. It's April 13th. And I guess first off, do you need a roll call or anything?
Yeah, let's go ahead and do a roll call for folks that are here.
Peyton, I guess we'll start with you.
Peyton Mason, Boston, Virginia.
Jackie Shannon, Chesapeake, Virginia.
J.C. Hudgens, Waterman, Virginia Waterman Association.
Early George, Waterman.
Beth Ledford, Ledhaven.
Sorry, man, my apologies. Richard Hardy, Purcell Seafood, Reedville, Virginia.
Ben Johnson, Johnson and Son Seafood in Suffolk.
I think just top the back there.
Tommy Callum, Weems, Virginia.
All right. I think that's everyone we have from SMAC in the room. And I don't think we have any callers yet. Dan Dice from Tangier and Don Porter may be joining us. I haven't heard, but I think that's it. We do think of a form. So.
Okay, all right. So I guess looking for approval of the agenda.
So moved.
Okay, I have a motion to approve the agenda. I have a second.
Second.
Any discussion? Okay, agenda's approved. Andrew. Okay, second one, approval of the minutes of the last Shellfish meeting. That was on February 16th. I'm looking for a motion for that. Approve the minutes of the last meeting.
Motion.
Okay, Rich approved it. Your second?
I'll second.
Ben seconds. Any discussion? Look okay? Okay. Approve the minutes from the last meeting, Andrew, so it's all you need?
Yeah. And apologies for not coordinating and getting everyone's appropriate title on the agenda items, but I've asked a number of groups and colleagues from VIMS to talk about a number of things today. And first on the agenda was oyster disease, and anything else Dr. Ryan Carnegie would like to speak on. You know, he's done a lot of work for a lot of years on you know, what pertains to us in terms of what's impacting the oyster resource. I kind of like to call this a VIMS day, so a lot of our VIMS colleagues are here, and they're taking up the majority of the agenda, and I'm just going to try to facilitate that discussion. And if there's any point where you have questions for VMRC staff, but try to have this be sort of an open discussion as we go through these agenda items today. But Ryan Carnegie is going to be up first, and then I believe Dr. Roger Mann is going to give an update on the Wreck Shoals oyster resource and the oyster survey. And then Alex is going to be giving us an update on some of the work that is ongoing in terms of some work that is funded by VMRC, primarily looking at replenishment efforts and economic impacts of what we've been doing in the Rappahannock for a number of years. And we'll have some discussion at the end on rotational harvest strategy, try to let that all flow together. But with that, I'll turn everything over to Ryan to let us know what's going on in the world of disease. Hopefully good things.
Good things. Okay, well, thank you, Andrew, and happy to have the opportunity to come and talk with you this afternoon. So I will be presenting a status of the major oyster diseases in the Chesapeake Bay region. What I will first do is just provide a little bit of introduction to sort of who we are and what we do in my lab at VIMS. So we are the Shellfish Pathology Lab, and we have really three major sort of foci of work in our group. The first is, let me see if I can move this.
Oh, he's taking care of it. You probably just hit that minimize maybe.
Yep, there we go. Yeah, the first and really sort of historically the most important part of the program has been this fisheries and aquaculture health management element. So this is what you see my staff and students working on here in the photos. And this really is our oyster disease monitoring program. So this is work that was basically constituted in its present form by Gene Burrison in the late 1980s, back when dermo disease really became the most important disease in the Chesapeake region. But aspects of our monitoring go back all the way to the 1950s when Jay Andrews was running the lab. We have two sort of major sides of this part of the program. The first, and you see a photo on the left of some cages we have in the York River. The first is our sort of targeted surveillance for the major oyster diseases of the Bay region. So we're paying most attention to MSX and dermo, the major pathogens that affect shellfish production in the Bay. And we have a number of different aspects to this sort of side of the program. We have a fall survey where we look at 30 Virginia oyster reefs every October, sampling 25 oysters from every one of those reefs. This is in the western tributaries of the Bay. We have 2 sites now out on the seaside. And we're just looking at, is this a bad year or not a bad year for the 2 major diseases? And is there anything else coming up that we need to be paying attention to? We have a James River quarterly survey where we extend 4 of our James River sites, not just in October, but to January, April, and July. Seaside quarterly, so our 2 seaside sites we're sampling January, April, July, and October as well. And we have in these cages here, this is a sentinel program where we have some animals from the upper part of the Rappahannock that are highly susceptible to diseases. We bring them down here to the beach at VIMS and let them get sick. And we see, is this a bad year for MSX and dermo based on how these animals do in the cages on the board. So that's sort of the targeted, systematic part of the program. And the other part is sort of what's happening that we learned from all of you on your harvest grounds, planting grounds, in commercial aquaculture, and so on. This is the sort of passive surveillance. It's what you're seeing, what doesn't look good, your animals are dying, and you let us know. You send us samples and we have a look and use that information, use that sort of sampling to sort of form impressions of what's going on out there. And we are nowadays up to something like 180 plus industry submissions a year that we do, just looking at what's going on. And a lot of this is business as usual movement of seed across state lines, but some of it is mortality events. So in terms of some of the other activities we have in the program, I'll just say just very briefly, we think about pathogens and disease, diversity and distributions, trying to understand what is where and how it got there, so we can sort of understand why and how diseases emerge and how they, get where they are and so on. It's kind of important that we do some of this kind of work just as we try to understand the way disease works in our systems. And the other major area that I'll highlight is this sort of evolutionary and historical ecology of marine diseases, where we try to think about the long view of how these diseases are doing, how these major pathogens are interacting with the oyster hosts or clam hosts, for example, how the pathogens are interacting with each other, how all of this is changing over time. And this seems sort of esoteric, this maybe just, does this connect at all to your interests or to management? And, the reason we think about these things is because it does connect to management. It is important. If we ask some questions about the evolution of these systems, we can ask whether we might see, familiar stories, our oysters' relationship with dermo disease, for example, in new ways as we use long-term data to shape our appreciation of how this system might be changing over time. And we could also ask whether it might reveal better approaches to marine resource management, which is really the point. So along these lines, thinking about the evolution, the changes in these systems, I mean, this is a headline, torn from the headlines of March 2nd in the Bay Journal. This is great news. I'm not focusing on the 2-week extension part, which I know was surely popular and justified, but just the fact that we're approaching a 35-year high in oyster abundance in the system, is great news. And I'm saying all this because these are points that I always want to make to the people that are overseeing management of Virginia shellfish resources. This is one of the key paragraphs from this article. Both states have also engaged for about a decade in large-scale oyster reef restoration projects. This was sort of front and center for explaining why our oysters are doing better in the system. The investment in large-scale oyster restoration in 5 Virginia locations, 5 Maryland locations. It was only further down in the article that there was this highlighting of the replenishment of public oyster reefs, the dredging of ancient shells, the planting of shell, and so on, the rotational harvest arrangements that have been designed through VIMS and VMRC collaboration more than a decade ago. This stuff is more important than we think for explaining why oysters have come back in the region. I mean, of course, the big projects get a ton of attention, and there's a lot of bang for the buck, surely in ecological services, where those big projects are cited. But the scale of the improvement in the oyster resources in the bay, the geographic scale from the bottom of the bay to the top of the bay in Maryland, it defies comprehension that it could just be 5 or 10 big projects in small tributaries. When we consider the size of Chesapeake Bay, something much bigger is happening. Part of that is what the Marine Resources Commission is doing, what Maryland DNR has been doing, the sustainable management and the innovative strategies for managing these oyster resources and keeping an eye on the ball, even at times, 15, 18 years ago when we were thinking about doing very different things with oyster resource management in the bay, but the management kept the eye on the ball and sort of steward this resource back to a better state. And of course, this is really on the science side. This is what we see happening and what we look at very closely in our program. The oysters themselves are doing something fundamentally different in the system. They're not dying at first encounter with these diseases. Maybe they're not living to be 15 or 18 years old like they might have, 30 or 40 years ago, but they're not dying at 1 year of age. More of them are living to be 2 or 3 or 4 or 5. As we have bigger oysters, those are more fecund oysters. The reproductive efficiency is greater. Those are bigger, heavier shells that don't dissolve or get broken apart as fast. Everything starts improving when we start seeing an improvement with regard to oyster performance facing these diseases. And we're seeing improvements in our data with regard to both MSX, oysters in our system are significantly resistant to MSX disease these days. And this is some of my students' work down here on the lower right. We're seeing resistance and tolerance to dermo disease. Dermo disease is not going away, and it still kills a lot of oysters every year, but it doesn't kill anywhere near as many oysters as it killed back in the 80s and 90s. And the oysters, even if they have significant prevalences of dermo, almost every oyster in our bay is going to be infected with dermo disease. The infections are generally tolerated much better than they used to be. These oysters are reproducing. They're going about their business fine for a few years before they ultimately die. So this is great news, and this is something that we'll continue to focus our research on, and I think we need to focus better on telling the story of why oysters are doing better in the region. And it's part of what the oysters are doing, but part of it is enlightened resource management by the fisheries agencies in the 2 states. So just a bit about where we are with the state of the diseases today. And this is just a little background on the 2 not all of you are going to be very familiar with these. Haplosporidium nelsoni is the parasite on the upper left, on the upper part of the screen. These are both protozoan parasites, single-celled organisms that live naturally in our marine systems. H. nelsoni, or MSX at the top, this is an exotic pathogen that came over from Asia sometime prior to 1959 when it emerged locally in our bay here. It caused tremendous mortality when it first emerged, much lower mortality now. But part of the problem with MSX is that it killed oysters very quickly. It took those oysters that might have lived 15 or 18 years and it was killing them within a couple of months. Perkinsus marinus, or dermo, at the bottom of the screen here, this is a native parasite that's probably always been here associated with the oysters in our system. This parasite was not much of a problem in the early years. It was enough of a problem that it was the focus of VIM's research in the 1950s and 60s, but it greatly intensified in its impacts in the 1980s, causing tremendous impacts out on the eastern shore and all the fisheries and planting grounds of the western shore, killing not just after 3 or 4 years as it had in the 50s and 60s, but after 3 or 4 months of exposure. Dermo too, though, like I said just a couple minutes ago, is not as much of a problem as it was before. So here's some real data for where we are. This is prevalence data for MSX in this graph. This is the mean prevalence across the 30 Virginia oyster reefs in our fall survey, and you can see how it's bumped around over time. The prevalence here, 15% at most. That sort of the prevalence, where MSX occurs, where the salinities are above 10 or 15 parts per thousand, tends to be higher. These data sort of average in a whole bunch of low salinity sites in the upper parts of the Rappahannock, in the upper part of the James, for example, that won't ever really see much MSX. But this is sort of the annual means as they've changed over time. And you can clearly see that in recent years, we've seen this trend going down. Even if all the way to the right, we're in a phase of sort of increasing MSX, it's just increasing slightly. We're finding a bit more MSX in our system. It's a bit more widespread than it had been, but the prevalence is very low. 2 oysters in a sample of 25 might be positive. Generally light infections. We see no indications that MSX is a significant problem today. The bigger story, as I suggested earlier, is still Perkinsus marinus, which still might kill 15 or 25 or maybe 30% in a bad year of market size oysters. So that's still significant. But for Perkinsus too, we're seeing a generally decreasing trend, a flat to slightly decreasing trend over time. We see an uptick in MSX, or dermo rather, prevalence in the last couple of years, but it's still below the long-term average. It's still only in the normal zone between the gray bars that mark the upper lower quartiles. Dermo is not a big deal at this point in time. No bigger deal anyway than it has been in the last few years. So, that's sort of where we are with regard to the major diseases. I'm not lying awake at night worrying about what we're doing with MSX and dermo. The oysters are doing a good job in terms of their adaptation to the parasites, and we're doing a good job of managing the resources to allow the oysters to work things out with the parasites through the sanctuaries, through rotational harvests, and so on. In terms of what's on the horizon, and I feel like I should always be looking forward and sharing with you what we're thinking about. this is this Pacific oyster mortality syndrome. This is this Austrian herpes virus that doesn't infect humans, but it's caused damage in Pacific oyster fisheries on the west coast of the US and a couple of places, most significantly in Europe and Australia and New Zealand. There's been increasing attention given to whether our oysters and our clams can be infected by this virus. Is it going to be a problem in our systems? Some of the most recent data suggest that there's some level of modest susceptibility or really a low level of susceptibility of our oysters to this virus. Experimental work that's being done out in the deserts of Arizona by a group that includes some VIM scientists suggests that there's a lot of oyster families that may be highly resistant, but there are a few. If there's a bunch of families being run that will show signs of being a bit susceptible, maybe there's a bit of mortality, maybe there's some viral infection. My concern is that these experiments and these data are going to be thrown out there, and a bigger deal is going to be made of them than needs to be made of them, which is why I'm bringing this up today. This is on our radar, and where we are pushing back on that is to basically ask, like, look, okay, maybe we can create some infections under intensive, forced conditions in the laboratory, injecting little oysters with 1 million virus particles, for example. But it needs to be demonstrated that this virus is capable of doing anything in the natural system of Chesapeake Bay, where no oyster is going to be automatically challenged by 1 million particles in a small petri dish or something. The system probably has a great deal of inherent resilience and resistance to the introduction of anything that's not capable of infecting and killing a lot of oysters at one time. So I feel like this is not something that we need to worry about at all, but it's something that I think before too long you might be hearing about. That there's experiments going on, that they're demonstrating some infections in C. virginica, and what does all this mean? So I really just want to express that, like, we're on top of this, we're thinking about it, we're paying attention to the data, we're asking the questions, and we're trying to make sure that this doesn't end up being something that's going to interfere with reasonable commerce in moving oysters around, for example, and so on. With that, I'll close, and I'll be happy to take any questions that anybody would have. Yeah.
With Caramel and MX, does salinity cause it, or certain waters that more predominant than others?
Yeah. A guy named Sammy Ray, who was one of the first scientists working on dermo beginning in the 50s, he would say that there's 3 things that are important with regard to dermo disease. The first thing is salinity. The second is salinity. And the third is salinity.
So the higher the salinity,
the higher the salinity, the more likely to see dermo disease. Salinity means everything in determining the local distribution of dermo disease in a system. So where the salinities are below about 10 parts per thousand, that's an area that is not going to see basically full dermo disease activity. The parasite will hang on at lower salinities, but it's not going to be significantly pathogenic. Where we're over 10 or 12, 15 parts per thousand, those are waters that are maybe characterized by full dermo activity. That doesn't mean a whole lot of oysters sick and dying, but that's where the parasites can be most active. Tommy?
What's the average age now across your survey zones that you see oysters perish from dermo?
I would have to defer to Roger and Missy on that in terms of what you think you're seeing in terms of oyster longevity in these reefs. They're looking at the same reefs that we are, exactly the same ones. So
The vast majority, if you look at the big oysters, you're probably in the 3 to 5 range, which, you've got some monsters in there which clearly never read the guidebook. But if you go back even 15, 20 years, you were not seeing oysters that old. And so I think the point that Ryan makes is that these ones that are getting bigger and older, yes, the oysters are doing good things on these areas where we have replenishment and management, and we can leave them alone for a period of time, they'll get bigger. And that is really sort of the crux of what we're doing in terms of this broad scale, rebuilding of the fishery. It's not that, I'm a fairly major critic of a lot of the restoration stuff, and we won't go into that. But the stuff that's been done, I think, as part of the replenishment work that this committee is a part of every year, is a very sensible ground building operation, and it's getting us to the point where we're starting to see more 3 and 4 and 5-year-olds. And that's super critical when it comes to maintaining the whole habitat piece of it.
The second part of that question, Ryan, would you be concerned? I mean, right, this is the first season in my entire career that we ended harvest areas with the amount of market size oysters still left in each area and guys in with their limit early and that sort of thing. Are you concerned that a 21 or 22 part salinity in the Rappahannock that we could lose a lot of oysters quickly based on the infection levels we're at now?
Well, I mean, the infection levels are not, I mean, they're not very high now. They've been high in recent years. They're climbing up a bit. I mean, we're not seeing a lot of infections in the early season like we've seen during some of the major outbreaks, the 80s. The 99 to 2002 window was a tremendous outbreak, and there were just, I mean, catastrophic levels of infection in April and May and June, which was remarkable, and certainly into the early summer. We're not seeing signs of a very early outbreak. I mean, I think, the large scale climatic, conditions are meaningful. I mean, we're moving out of this La Nina phase, which is a good thing. And the La Nina's, in this sort of global, climate, dynamic. The La Nina phase that's the warm, dry conditions for the Southeast region that tend to promote the dermal outbreak. So moving out of that, I mean, to me, gives me some optimism that as we look toward the summer and fall, we're not going to be in a hot, dry scenario. So, I'm not concerned from anything I see that we're going to see a huge amount of mortality. I think it's probably going to be just typical. I mean, maybe on the higher end of the 15 to 30%, but it's not going to be 50 or north of that.
And to your point, I asked the question, in 97 and 98, we thought we were out of the woods and we were setting areas aside saying, oh, we'll harvest those,
Yeah.
and we were looking for that big year in 99 and obviously didn't get it.
Things do change, and we, this is part of what, we've been working on, in our labs, looking at these evolutionary events. We had the big one in the 80s that it was a different Perkinsus that emerged in 86 or 87. And, 99 to 2002 was, I mean, in terms of the climate factors, I mean, those were favorable years for disease, but it was also a time when something different happened with the parasite. From one end of that period to the other end, there was a change in the parasite.
So actually, that could have been something we needed to go through to be able to get to the point we're at.
Well, maybe, right. And that's, a lot of the modeling that's been done, in Delaware Bay, for example, which is, a smaller, simpler system than ours, but everything's the same between the two systems. I mean, they're working similarly. And we know from that modeling work that these intense outbreaks that sweep the entire oyster population with this intense infection pressure, I mean, that's a selective event that's going to leave a stronger population standing. What doesn't die is going to have the right set of genes. And I think we see that in our data very clearly. But we should always be cautious that, I mean, there have been surprises, and there could be surprises again.
Third slide back, it looks almost cyclical.
Yeah.
It's like 3-6 years, there's a bump, and then the 3-6 years, there's a bump. Is there any other data or anything else that's studied, along with it at the same sampling sites? Is there, what are the other factors that might cause that to look like that? It looks too neat.
Yeah, that's a great question, and you're right. It does look too neat, and we certainly think about that. I mean, both of the data sets show this trend. And I mean, the MSX data, is always particularly intriguing. Like, we have no idea where MSX is lurking in the environment when it's not infecting oysters. Dermo just infects directly from oyster to oyster. MSX doesn't, and we see in those cycles, those waves, you know, I mean, it makes me wonder if that's not a wave of the worm or the small copepod or whatever it is that the parasite's infecting when it's not in the oysters. For dermo, you know, it probably connects more directly to sort of the cycles of temperature and salinity and so on, and precipitation in the watershed.
But they're the
That's probably
same
what the story
testing
is.
site, so it's nothing to do with that.
No, they're all the same sites we visit every year. Yeah, and that's the sites that, you know, Andrew and the Marine Resources Commission with Missy and Roger, it's all that same sampling that integrates all this stuff.
Do you think parasites affect the quality of the meat of the oyster?
You know, I think only at their highest intensities, you
Because
know.
some areas we see, even though they might be high salinity, the oysters really never get what you would call fat, you know.
Yeah,
And, you know, I'm thinking like Deep Rock, you know, 5 pints or something like that. They just never seem to want to fatten up, you know, like some other areas in the Rappahannock where 3 pints butter, 3 pints butter, you know.
yeah,
You know?
yeah, and, you
I think
know,
it's what the warm water continues all the time.
Yeah.
They never actually stop spawning.
yeah,
To some extent.
I mean, part of it could be that. I mean, just sort of an extended period of spawning, and they're just.
We don't get really cold winter, cold water anymore. Like you
yeah.
said.
But you know, but dermo disease, you know, I mean, it infects every oyster. Certainly, at like Deep Rock, I mean, every oyster is going to be infected with it. From midsummer to later summer, the intensities of infection are going to start climbing up to sort of intermediate levels, which is about as intense as they're going to get. But those infections are exerting consequences on the animal. They may not kill the animal, but they're sort of drawing down the animal's resources. They're preventing it from maintaining or reaching good condition. That's going to be part of it for sure.
Interesting.
So, basically, pretty much y'all asked my question, but dermo and MSX is up and down. You were just saying that chart, but so it seems like over time, nature's kind of took care of itself because unless we get a different strand,
Yeah.
they're kind of somewhat built up immunity to the
Mhm.
previous strands of the dermo and MSX.
Yeah.
So nature's took care of itself in a way.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
But you know, that was not something we were taking for granted in the region ever. You know, because we had this perception as a community that, you know, the oysters, you know, in the high disease parts of, you know, the Rappahannock and the James and the system in general were too sick to reproduce. The only reproduction was happening in low salinity waters. And we were never going to see this evolution of any resistance to the diseases because the animals that were being exposed to the diseases were so sick they weren't able to pass on their genes. And the only animals that were reproducing were the ones that were up, you know, up at Ross Rock and the Rappahannock and so on. Now I know Tommy's got some big oysters in his box down there. We started, you know, this was in the early 2000s in the lower Rappahannock. We started seeing these bigger oysters down there. You know, that clearly had to have been living there for 8 or 10 years or whatever. And I carry them around when I give presentations. That's what got us to start asking questions about this stuff. That we like, if everything was just dying because of the parasites and is too sick to reproduce, how do we explain these giants that are, I mean, they're not super abundant, right? But there are big oysters there in the high disease areas. And so we started asking questions and looking more closely at the data and collecting new data. And we found that, yeah, these oysters in the high disease part of the bay, I mean, they're doing better. They're not getting as sick as they used to get, you know, as sick as they used to. You know, for a given level, you know, this intermediate level of infection that all these oysters are going to have, they're doing just fine. They're reproducing, they're passing on their genes, and that's what's making the system work.
And everywhere, I mean, I drudge and JC and all drudge around, we see big oysters, not that dinosaur he just brought.
Yeah.
You see more big oysters all the time. I mean, you guys probably see big oysters all the time. You see small stuff.
Is there any value in these big? I mean, that was the reason I bought these. We were getting towards the end of area 2. They had moved, that's I guess below. I don't know if you're familiar with that area, but Mosquito Point in that area is it any benefit for hatchery stock or what have you for those?
Well, I think that's a question. That's a question for the breeding program. I mean, yes, there's a value in them for sure. I mean, and that's why we like.
Not much value in shucking them.
Well, but I mean, there's just so many oysters that even if they're not growing to that size, they're living to be 3 or 4 or 5 years old, and we like the fact that sanctuaries are being incorporated into the management, here and there, because they're giving these animals that have the right set of genes to be able to live, more than just 2 or 3 years, to live as long as they can live and reproduce as many times as they can reproduce and pass those genes on. Like, we like that. The rotational harvest schemes, like, they don't give these animals that many chances, but they give them a few more chances to spawn, and that's a good thing. So inherent in all of that strategy is a belief that, yes, those oysters they're immensely valuable. I mean, any given one oyster, maybe not, but as a population, like these more abundant oysters that are living longer, like, let's keep them going. Yeah.
And we're actually, and we're seeing that evidence in more consistent, larger spat sets.
Mhm.
So, and that's been happening for maybe the last decade or so, where the spat sets that we see are higher than they have been in the past, and they're happening more often. Like, instead of getting a decent spat set once every 5 years, it's happening once every other year, once every 3 years. So it's kind of, so the population is like perpetuating itself. So they're also very important because the bigger oysters produce a lot more gametes, so.
How was the meat in those, were they kind of poor, or?
Yeah, it certainly wasn't what, the 3 to 4 inch
Expect-
oysters were, but yeah, it's, they were healthy, I guess, is a way to
There's a
to
YouTube
explain.
video out there, I guess, in some Asian market of plate-sized oysters. You just order one, but it's a knife and fork ordeal. It's just a matter of personal taste, I think.
All right. Well, thank you. Oh, wait, Jackie, one more question?
Yeah, the Pacific oyster mortality syndrome,
Yeah.
you may have mentioned this, is that also a parasite?
It's a virus.
Okay.
Yeah.
And is it transmitted directly from oyster?
It's a virus transmitted directly from oyster to oyster. Yeah. But, it's a problem in Pacific oyster systems where there is mortality. There are very high levels of viral infection that continue to drive this. I think, we are going to look at this very closely in our system. But I really believe that, if most of the oysters if most eastern oysters in our system are not capable of getting infected or developing very intense infections, they're going to filter out the virus and the virus is gone. That should keep the levels of infection so low that even if there's a ship comes in from Asia and brings the virus, which has surely happened before now, and nothing is taken off in our system, that suggests that our oysters, our resource, is refractory to that virus and just generally resilient in the face of that particular challenge. So we just, we can't let this get out of control.
I think I have one more question. I think France had a problem with something similar. Is
Yeah.
that anything that's a problem foreseen here in the United States? I don't know what it was, the dermal MSX. But is that something that we worry about here in the United States, where they had to wipe out some of France's oysters?
Well, that's the same virus. That's the same
The
virus.
one on the west.
And it's present on the West Coast in like Tamales Bay, California, north of San Francisco. The strain the strain of the virus that's been most problematic in Australia, New Zealand, and France was found in San Diego Bay, and that's what some of the experimentation is going on.
So I think we made the right call with our native oyster restoration, then, I guess.
We did, yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Ryan. I think, Roger, your group is up next.
Next, all right. So there's a couple of things I'm going to try and sort of show you here. I don't like these computers, but we'll see how they work. Let's see what's my cursor here. I'm going to talk a little bit about the survey. Many of you have seen parts of this before, so I apologize for repetition. But as Ryan said, if you think about the history of what we do here, Ryan referenced work that was done before him by Gene Gerson and was done before him by Jay Andrews. So the history of the oyster disease program here goes back a very, very long way. The history of oyster surveys in this institution, depending upon when you want to start, actually precedes the formation of this institution. There were oyster surveys in the 1940s that were done in the James by Victor Lusinoff. In the early days of this institution, Dexter Haven started some programs. And in fact, when I inherited essentially Dexter's program, there was in some instances 30, 35 years worth of data. And those were sort of superimposed on other monitoring programs that Jay Andrews did. So there's a long history of oyster monitoring that relates to the state of the resource. There weren't always the same methods. And so part of the problem that you have when you try to sort of answer the question of how many oysters there are in the bay, or how many oysters can we manipulate, the answer has always been sort of bounded by the way in which you do surveys. And I can remember I came here on January 1 in 1985, in February 1985, going down in the midst of a snowstorm to the BMRC building with Dexter, sitting in a smoke-filled room and trying to work out what you were all doing with all the survey data. And I was completely confused. Some years later, Jim Wesson and I got together and we tried to work out how we could do a quantitative survey. And at that point in time, I had in fact been working with the surf climb people offshore. And so I actually went to the National Marine Fisheries Service lab in Woods Hole, took their survey, and we basically copied what they did and we put it into operation here in the bay. And that was when we first started our patent tongue surveys in the middle 1990s. Started with the James, the Anchor and the Great Wacomico, and since then we've sort of expanded to what we do. And so many of you have seen these debates about what we do with patent tongue surveys. So each year, our standard tool is an hydraulically operated tongue. Stratified random surveys, and this is always one thing I get a question about. So the table's an oyster reef. We know that there's oysters on it. We know that they're not uniformly spread. How do I sample this in the right place? Nobody ever believes me, and so I'm going to give you a little piece of math, and you can take it home and do this. I've got 100 oysters in 100 squares on here. So you know that there's 100 oysters there, with the average of 1 in each square, and then you're allowed to rearrange them. You can't put more than 7 oysters in one square because you can't fit it. And the question is, if I take out a set of random number tables, how many squares do I have to sample before I can say that the average is 1 per square? And the answer is about 7. When I tell people that, they don't believe it. I've actually got slideshows that do this, where we randomize squares over and over and over and over again, and that's how the answer comes out. And they are not chosen on top of where the oysters are. They're chosen at random.
In other words, you can do a random thing and tell me how many oysters on that rock.
Yes.
I don't believe
I mean, and he's perfectly entitled to do that. And if they had a blackboard in here, I'd do it with you.
If you could tell me what was on Wix's, I wouldn't believe it. How many come off, and you wouldn't believe what you tell me.
One day, providing you.
I'll tell you what I'll do.
I'll tell you what.
I'll let you do your picture shit when they open a rock, and you tell me how many's going to be on it, and if any of you will see how close you are.
Okay, and we'll do it. We'll do it over a few Coronas. I don't drink.
We'll see how far off you are. I would say you will be way off.
So anyway, the point is that we do this, and if you use a standard technique, then what you end up with is a long-term trend. And what we're looking for is not on any one particular day the strong answer. So actually, we're asking different questions. But what we want to know is over long-term, how is this thing changing? And that's what Ryan's talked about. And so we take these samples and we measure all these things in it. We do oyster density, and we collect a lot of information about shell. Now, if you live in the world of fish, they can't understand why we do this. But with oysters, you're actually managing two things. You're managing the oysters and you're managing the shell, and they don't grow and disappear at the same rate. And so this has always been one of my pet peeves about the way in which we do restoration. You know, we measure oysters and we claim that we've got it all worked out, and the shell disappears and then it all goes belly up. But, this is a standard approach, and what I'd like you to look at is this. Because if you want to know how we do it, okay, this is my iPhone 6. It was a third generation cast off. I get my phones, my kids pass them down. I'm the last one before they get junked out. If you go to the web server and you type in Bosara space oysters, it brings you to our website. I'm going to show you some of that about that a bit later on. It's this whole idea of if you've got an area, how do you sample it? I'm going to show you some stuff that we've collected from the Wreck-Shoal Sanctuary area. I'm not picking on anybody here. I just want to show you what data looks like, and then we can talk about how it works. You'll see lots of graphs that look like this thing, and these are really intimidating when you start this. It's like, oh God, now all he's going to do is just load it all up and we can't see what the hell's going on. Well, let's just look at what we've got in one of these sorts of areas in terms of oyster density. So we go from 1998 to 2022. We know down here things were terrible because of diseases. This is when things start changing. And what we've seen, and Ryan pointed this out, is since then we've seen these sorts of recoveries. We have lots and lots and lots and lots of data like this, and you can tell me, are you making any money here? No.
Before that, I made a lot.
Yeah, and then the
A whole
disease,
lot more I do now.
and then the diseases came along and clobbered it. And since then,
Yeah, and I got news for you, it's gonna come along again.
yeah, and so here we've got this area here
Every 25 years.
where it starts to work. And the important thing is that once you start sort of putting all these things together, you can actually track things through time. And it's the tracking through time that's sort of important. You can track where the shell goes as well. This is the black shell that's underneath it. This is the brown shell. The brown shell is what's important. You've heard Andrew say many times, we're targeting 10 liters per square meter. Well, what's that? It's the equivalent of one shell thick laid on the bottom. That's not much shell, but it's all that you've got. You have a limited amount of money. How are you going to spread it about to try and do what you want to do? And the other thing is that much isn't going to build you a reef by itself, because you get sedimentation, it gets broken up. And what you really want to do is to have enough oysters there to keep it going. But by good management, what you see over time, this is a repletion. What you see over time in these areas is that this is actually getting up to that mark. And this is what we're trying to do. We're trying to build some stability into the whole thing. There's 77 samples out in there. And what you end up with when you look at these things over time is this. So what does this tell us? This is the boundary of our sanctuary. What we've got here is a scale, the amount of shell that's out there. And so if you start back here in 2018, you go through 2021, and then into 2022, what you see is that these areas of shell are starting to disappear. There are lots and lots and lots and lots of samples out here. So this isn't a problem about the fact that we don't have many samples. What we're trying to do when we look at these things is give you some advice on how the environment's working, what's happening out there, and we're going to leave it up to you to try and decide how you manage this. But the point of these long-term data sets, this is a really healthy situation. You've got a lot of stuff out there where you've got over 15 liters per square meter. This is way above the sort of the benchmark. Then it starts to disappear. And by the time you get down to here, you've got less than 1/3, and in many cases, a quarter of what you want for that benchmark. And that's from 2018 to 2022. So, the point about these sort of data sets that we have is if you look at them in the long term, you can tell where things are going. And that's important in terms of how you manage it. The question was asked about how fast do oysters grow, and that relates to how are you going to sort of consider this whole idea of rotational management. You've got a 3-inch limit, how fast does it grow? It turns out that when we take all this stuff, we measure all these oysters. Our database at this point is somewhere between 2.5 and 3 million measurements. And so you can plot them on things like this. So these are the intervals in terms of the lengths in millimeters. Sorry, I'm metric. I came from the other side of the Atlantic. And you can plot these things on any particular year. So here what you've got, these are all the spat. And in the following year, you grow to this, and in the following year, So what you can do is that mathematically you can separate these things into year classes. Alex is going to show you a little bit about this later on. And so the point about these, and I have dozens of these plots, I can take you from 2006 onwards from multiple places, everywhere from Tangier all the way down to the lower part of the James. And what you see are these standard sort of situations where you get, these are the SPAT, then you get the year class, and then another year class, and this is where you are. You might get a few of them that make it to 3 inches in 2 years. The vast majority of them, 3. And this is a simple one. If you want me to bore you, I could keep you here till 10 o'clock and show you all the rest of them. But the point here is that one of the nice things that comes out of this data is it tells you how fast they grow. But the other thing that you can do with this stuff, once you actually start dividing it up, these are the 1-year-olds, the 2-year-olds. This was a crappy year. And what you see here is that these are the 2-year-olds and these are the 3-year-olds, but you know what? They're dying. Once you get out here, what you see is a lot more of them surviving. So this information not only tells you about how fast they grow, it tells you what proportions of them die as well. So these are the sorts of things that we start to put into sort of quantitative calculations that sort of back up completely independently the stuff that Ryan's telling you. He sees diseases going in, but he doesn't see animals dying. We see spat sets, and we can actually follow them through and check on those that are actually growing quite well. And we don't see them dying in the way that they used to do during the late 90s and the early 2000s. But in fact, this 2006 to 2008 period was where a lot of this stuff changed. And it's been going well ever since. And Missy has pointed that out to you. The other thing I'd like to sort of point out with these long-term trends is, so I'm going to show you a data set that comes from Pointy Shoals. And again, you can make this, you say, well, what happened here? What happened on Pointy Shoals in 2018? That was the year we had a banzai removal of both markets and seed. So you can actually track these things over time and retrospectively go back and find it. And you can also see that when you took out a lot of seed, you took out a lot of shell as well. And all of this, again, comes back into the question of what do you do with this long-term data? What you're trying to do here is stabilize it. You get great years, but then you have to be a little bit careful and let it build back, and then it goes
Can you
again.
look in the future?
Well, one of the things that you'd like to do, actually, with this one.
Year to year, can you look ahead?
Yeah, that's the whole point of this. In that if I can give you a projected growth curve, and I can change the rate at which they die, I can change the mortality curve, which is essentially what Tom has got sitting in his box. You know, if you can tell me the increasing proportion of the 4-year-olds and the 5-year-olds and the 6-year-olds, you change the rate at which they die slightly, then you can project that out. And that's exactly what fish people do. And one of the reasons why it's so difficult with oysters is that the simplest way to actually get this information with oysters, you have to measure tons of them and then you have to separate these curves mathematically. It's a lot easier with fish because you take the otoliths out and you count the rings. But yes, one of the whole intentions of doing this is to get us to the point where we can take this information and we can actually do forward projections. And you know, there are two problems with that. One of them is actually measuring the mortality rate and the growth rate, then trying to ascribe how much of that goes to the disease. If you can do both of those, then I think you can do a forward projection. And in fact, as I said, I stole all this from the National Marine Fisheries Service, who do this for surf clams. This is just a surf clam survey that I put in here. And we do those projections all the time for surf clams. We've been doing them for the last 30 years and they work. So one of my goals, in fact, is to get this to the point where we can actually do that. Again, there's lots and lots and lots of this data. And rather than sort of bore you with lots of it, what I'd like to do, in fact, is take you back to the end of this. And again, take you back to this one. So this is going to get me to Bosara, is it, Missy?
No, click on the Firefox.
Click on Firefox, this one?
Yes. There you go.
Apologies. Wrong one. Too many windows open. This is something that you can dial up on your computer or even on your smartphone. Even my 13-year-old smartphone will get me here. If you dial this in, if you just put in these words followed by oysters, you come to this map. And so what we have is, so you want to go to a place up here somewhere on the Rappahannock, perhaps. Oh, this comes up slightly differently. How do I choose the?
Click on the,
There we go. So here we are, and we can choose where we are. This is the Rappahannock, and these are all the reefs in it. So we can choose a reef in the Rappahannock. And it'll tell you about drumming ground. It'll tell you everything that we know about drumming ground. You can follow the information that's written out. You can tell you what years it was open and closed. We can give you all the information that relates to it. So the purpose of this thing is, again, to give you the long-term running descriptions of the information that we collect and where does it go. This is it's a bit clunky. It was designed 15 years ago. And in fact, one of the things that we are trying to do at this point is to get this to a point where it's in a geographical information system. But hopefully you will be able, maybe a year from now, to go into this, go to a map, and instead of getting this, is actually to get multiple layers of information that you can ask questions of. How many big oysters, how old they are, how much they're spawning, what diseases, and you can get all of it in one place. That's one of the things that we're working on and trying to put projections into it. So there's a lot of stuff that's buried underneath here that you don't see. And this is what we spend a lot of our time doing, so that when you go to an SMAC meeting and Andrew gets up and tells you this stuff, it's a distillation from all of the surveys that we do. The surveys have been done now in collaboration with BMRC for nearly 30 years. And, it's been a wonderful relationship. We can't do this with sort of out each other because there isn't enough money to do it. A lot of the early years that we did this, you don't want to know where the money came from because it didn't come from, I stole it from other places. We now have it stabilized. We can put it into these discussions. How you ladies and gentlemen want to use them is, again, a matter for you to interpret, and that's your job. My job is to give you the information and answer questions the best that I can. That's what we do. We continue to do it. And, if you have any more questions about it, I'd be happy to try and answer them. Tommy.
Roger, your point about using the information and so forth. I think the survey is an awesome way to get a snapshot of what's going on and, what you're seeing, how many percentage of markets and so forth. But, Jim always we've stopped doing it, but he would estimate based on the survey, the number of bushels that were in an area, so forth. And
we can do that.
2003 through 2009, our company was buying more oysters in a lot of cases than was estimated to be there for the total population. And if you take an area just like Drumming Ground, and if you take the 28.95 acres and you take the number of market oysters and you pick individual areas you're going to harvest, it's just always been tough to make the math work with what we're actually seeing. So,
no, good point. Very good point. One is that I can do that, and the number will nearly always come out low because our surveys don't cover everywhere that's in that area. So part of the problem is that we don't do all of it. We don't do all of it because, quite frankly, we don't have the resources to do it. And the other thing is that when we first designed this, the first question was, well, what do we actually go and survey out there? And so what we did was we went back to the original Baylor maps that you're all familiar with that are now about 130 years old. And then in the 1960s, before I came in the 60s, the 70s, early 80s, Dexter resurveyed all of that stuff. Sadly, he never got the credit for it, but one of the first things that I inherited when I came here was all these giant Mylar maps. And so you'd have a map. And this was Baylor area, and this was oyster reef, and this was sand, and this was mud, and whatever. And then we digitized all of those, the first sort of thing that we digitized. And the question was, in this area, how much of it is oyster bottom? And so the part of the problem that you have when you take a Baylor area in a place like the lower Rappahannock, and you know this, as does everybody who's fished there, all those Baylor areas aren't all oyster bottom. And so when we got down to the point of how do we survey it, then the next question is, first of all, how many chunks can you take in a day? How many days have you got? And which areas are we going to target? And so what you're doing, you're cherry picking these things to start with. When we first started doing this, there was no way on earth that we could actually do all of it in a reasonable time period. So you end up not doing stuff. So there's stuff out there where you guys go fish, we never survey. So my numbers are always going to be low. Which comes back to your point, my numbers will always be low. But the point is that the areas that we go out and survey have been consistent now for 30 years. And if those are representative of everything that's out there, as my numbers go up and down, your numbers should go up and down as well. I mean, if you want me to do that, to give you an estimate, I mean, I can do that. It's going to give you the bottom line of where you are. But it doesn't surprise me at all that you're above that. That's how we got to it. And you know, the answer is can you fix it? And the other answer is, given the resources that we have and the fact that you try to do this within sort of a 30-day period, the answer to that is no, because we're trying to cover everywhere effectively from Lynn Haven to Pocomo.
And I respect that. It's just, there's a, misconception sometime among, particularly when something goes to the commission from the information we have, that this is like holy grail and this is exactly what we've got and we've got to make a decision based on this number.
Yeah.
And, you answered my question, it's impossible to know exactly what that number is, but,
well, I think it's two things. One is, yeah, if you want to go through all the details about how we got there, you're never going to sample all of it. The other thing is that you guys that go fish out there know where all these other places are, and you're always going to pick that up. I think the question that you have when you look at this holy grail type thing, it shouldn't be, is if I'm out there sampling 50% of it, is my 50% representative of the total? And so, as I said, so we have this number for point of shoals. I can pick it out and you say, well, what happens? So we got that number based upon probably 40 grabs. But we also know that year, 500,000 bushels came off that particular reef, and you can see it go down. You can see it go back up next year. So, it's the barometer. It's your blood pressure test. So you're always going to end up with those two that are different.
and I'm not criticizing.
No, it's a fair criticism.
I think it's a tool and a strong tool and one that, it obviously the wreck shows, for example, something's going on, whether you only know 10% of what's there, there's something still going on. So I'm not questioning that.
And this idea about what's the error bar around this. I've not tried to do the math about this because I'm still struggling to understand. For the last 30 years, I've dealt with the surf clam fishery, both at the industry people and with the NIMS people, and they have these sorts of problems. And trying to estimate the error around these things is mathematically a really interesting challenge in terms of, just how big is the error bar around it. And sometimes the error bar gets really big, and then sometimes it gets really small. And the point that you have to sort of keep doing is not to obsess about any one particular number. You have to ask yourself, am I managing it well over time? And I keep coming back to this because I point at you, and sometimes it's embarrassing for you more than me. We sat in a room in a building that used to be over there when we actually designed this rotation. The rotation that's in the Rappahannock, the one that we actually adopted, was the one that you suggested, and it was a brilliant move. I must admit I was a little bit worried about it at that point in time, but what we ended up with is something that, and you'll see this in the data that Alex, you can see, the accumulation, the harvest, the accumulation, the harvest. And while you may not sort of have a look at these things in terms of, well, if you do the area and you multiply it, how many bushels came out? Well, that's not the ones that came across my dock. The point is that you can see how this works. And the important thing is that if you think that strategy works, then the question is, should you adopt it? And the answer is yes. And what we've been doing it now, for 15, 16 years. And I don't think there's anybody in this room who would argue that it's been just a success. And that's the really important part. You have to have the patience to look at the long term.
I think, one thing, referring to the drumming ground, survey was done with that and we merged that particular area. So I think it's hard to, most of the time you have a lot more people doing the grudging there than you would Pat Dong. So I think that's one of the reasons why you see such a more productive harvest, you know.
Yeah, but I'm going by the overall, we're estimating the total number, or trying to get a feel for the total number of oysters. It doesn't matter if you pick them up by hand, or you patent tong them, or you hand, you know, that's a whole different conversation.
One thing that we haven't done with this, you know, again, it's a long-term trend thing. I can remember when we decided to open these areas, we were actually sitting in a room over in that building, and there was this debate about whether it was going to be dredges or tongs. And it's the only time I've been pleased that we had 4 Marine policemen in the room. Because I can tell you that the two groups really got into a very heated discussion about this. And, you know, I'm sure at this point in time, there are still those who believe one way or the other. You know, Andrew has argued that we should move towards patent tongs in these areas because it's better for preserving the shell on the bottom. I think if you start to look at all these data, one of the things that actually we can start doing in these things is asking just how well the shell layer stands up when you do it by patent tong versus doing it by hand scrape. Again, it's going to be a relative number, but I think as you look at that over time and ask yourself, you know, how are you going to manage it? And at least my understanding, and you can correct me for this, a lot of those areas, especially down in the lower part of the Rappahannock, they're not broad reefs, they're actually this shape, and you tong on the top of them. Well, doesn't it make any sense that if you keep dredging them, you're going to bust them up too much? And what happens? Yeah, once you've done that, I mean, are they ever going to be the same?
I used to go down there with 6-foot heels. Now they're all
Yeah.
maybe 2 foot.
But
So
you got a lot bigger area than you had then too.
you see, now this is sort of the interesting debate. Which way should you manage it? And at this point, I don't have the data, but you have two really interesting viewpoints.
And in order to get there, we've got to compare effort. I mean, if you put 100 patent tongers on the areas that we've put 100 hand scrapes, it's going to look a lot different than what 16 patent tongers look like on, pick a number, acres. I mean, it's to quantify this and really get in the weeds on it. You've got to be apples to apples with what you're talking about. And
You gotta look at something else too. You're looking at all this computer work and your 13-year-old phone, and some of us are still using equipment they used 150 years ago.
Yep.
There's something wrong with that. I mean, we need to wake up and do something a little different. Can't catch with 8 bushels. What difference does it make how you catch them?
Well, you know, one of the wonders of a public
You don't
fishery,
do away with them.
one of the wonders of having a public fishery is that everybody owns it. And so
Everybody owns it.
So the question then becomes, you know, how are you going to spread it around? Are you going to go to the Delaware Bay model where you've got what now, I think it's 7 companies that own all the permits there? So they can use a big boat to dredge, or you're going to do it the way you do now, where to a large extent you have everybody who's got a license can go fish there. And it's just a matter of, I think it's a social debate about how you do that. I'm not getting into that because, you know, that's not what I do. But your point is a good one. And I mean, if you look at the other example of this, look at the offshore scallop industry here. If you've ever been to sea on a scallop boat, you know, it's one of the craziest, most dangerous things I've ever seen. I spent 2 trips out on the one, and you know, people work 18-hour shifts, everything's shucked by hand.
If you went on a dredge boat first day of the season.
Yeah. But again, if you look at the way the Canadians do it, everything's mechanized. So which way is the better way of doing it? Do you want a fishery that employs people, or do you want a fishery that's maximized by using a particular form of gear? And I think that's it's an interesting social problem. Historically, it's always been one that maximizes access to all of the people that's out here.
That's a very good point to your Delaware Bay with scallop fishery either. And I guess, one of the things I've been concerned with this, how we manage this is you got to make a decision. The scallop fishery is 3 companies now.
Yeah.
I mean, you get Wanchese, Eastern Fish, and the guys in New Bedford, and that's it, as opposed to you're not that awfully long ago when we had more, 10 companies in Virginia that were scalloping, so.
Well, if you look at it, I mean, I'm 71 years old, okay? I think that the average age of a guy who goes out tonging these days is actually pretty close to my age. There's been a lot of young people who've come into it, but with all due respect, all of us who've got gray hair are eventually going to have to give this up, or we're going to fall overboard, and that'll be the end of it anyway. If you're looking out 20, 30 years, how many people are you going to have in this fishery? Is the average age going to be 20 to 40 years old? If we manage to get this to the point where we can produce, 500,000 bushels a year, how are we going to harvest them? Are we still going to be out there dredging with a scraper? Are we going to be hand tonging? How are we going to do it? And it's been, one of these things that I've watched, for 40 years now, and it always goes backwards and forwards and ends up in the same place. At least in the public fishery, it does. Looking forward, I don't know where it's going to go.
I'm using equipment now my granddaddy used.
Yeah. And
Nobody else
why,
can say
why,
that,
yeah, well, why are you using that? It's because that's the way in which
because they make us use that.
it's the way in which the fishery is regulated.
Everything went ahead except for us.
But if you were at the point where,
You're not using a pencil.
but if you're at the point where, for example, we were to invite the Delaware Bay fisheries dredges to come down here, how many boats do you think we could support? How many people will be put out of business?
What do you mean?
Well, how many Delaware Bay boats will we need to run the Rappahannock? 4 or 5?
I wouldn't even want to discuss, you're talking two 6-foot dredges pulling with automatic colors that could wipe the Rappahannock out and.
2 per boat, right?
Yeah, it's just, but no, I wouldn't even think that.
But I didn't know a Delaware boat could work in Virginia.
No,
But-
I'm not talking about.
But to your point, socially, and this is a big thing that we've got to figure out
Yeah.
pretty soon is, do you want a fishery with about 15 or 20 people in it and $115 bushel oysters and go in the direction scallop, or
Yeah.
or are we going to try to maintain an industry at the level that we're at? And we've pretty soon got to figure that out, because we're going to lose that 71-year-old guy. Unfortunately, we're losing that fast. So we're at a point of trying to figure out what our goal and what our vision and so forth is.
5 years from now, it'll be completely different. Look on the water. These 2
Trump
guys
said
right
you
here,
better wherever the man's gonna push that red button.
these are some of the hardest working watermen right in front of me right now.
Yeah.
They're not young bucks.
Anyway,
What do you think the ratio is?
Oh.
Above 40 and under 40?
So 30, so right in front of me, when you just look at commercial card holders across the board, so that's gotta be some kind of representation of the oyster industry as well. About 30% are under the age of 50 and about 70% are over the age of 50.
There you go.
So if you wanna go 70 or older, you're looking at almost 20% 70 or over, and almost 50% of everyone is age 60 or older. So that just kind of represents it across all fisheries, but that really has to be representative of the oyster fishery as
That's a
well.
good thing to put on your board.
yeah,
But this is,
That's the truth.
yeah.
but this is
It
not,
ain't no up and down. That's the truth. This is.
this is a much deeper conversation.
That problem
though,
has nothing to this problem.
Because the regulations, I have grandsons who are teenagers. I have a son who's in the fishery. We have set up regulations and difficulties to even allow those young people to come into the fishery. We don't let people transfer to family members like we used to. We don't let people bring people into the fishery as apprentice like we used to. You know, there's too many barriers in the system now and overpriced fees to let people even try to get into the fishery. That's a whole different subject. You know, we built up, what am I gonna do? You know, I can't stay out there on the water much longer. And yet my 16-year-old grandson can't do it because I can't transfer to him.
Yes, you can.
Not without paying a fee.
And all that's coming in the next 10 years. I don't know what that's gonna do.
I mean, $300 for the, you have to pay once you guys, you can transfer your eligibility.
And when that goes, this ain't gonna be here.
We just don't have, we don't have systems set up to encourage people to come into the fishery. That's my point.
And that point's not lost on the agency as well. One thing that Commissioner Green, and he's got me working on it as well as a few other people, is trying to introduce some sort of apprenticeship program, not only for oysters, but also working watermen across, whether it be marine mechanics, whether it be dockside. I mean, it's a problem that's recognized and not lost. The solution is not easy short term, but it is something that we are working towards and starting some grassroots things to get there long
Because
term.
philosophically, we have to want that change.
Exactly, and I think you're on board with the agency as well.
And it's a good point, I mean, the thing that these guys have to face, I mean, I don't see where we're at a point where you just open it up and let anybody that wants an oyster license come in. I think we've gotten down to our threshold of where we need to be, and we need to maintain that. We've got to figure the part out of how Ernie and JC get replaced with someone that wants to come in and an apprenticeship, and we don't, I mean, we can't open the floodgates and just say anybody that's 18 to 30 years old, come on and get an oyster license and go oystering. So
Oh, there's no doubt you're right about that.
but we can figure it out 15 years from now.
Exactly.
No, it'll be too late.
Well, unfortunately, this is not a problem localized in just oyster. This is a nationwide problem. Every business I talk to, you probably talk to, it's a problem.
Anyway. I will not-
Thank you, Ron.
Alex is gonna talk to you a little bit about some of the work that she's doing with both myself and Andrew Shellfish, who's a professor here. Andrew's an economist. And so we've sort of put Alex in the middle of this, looking at some of the Rappahannock data with the idea of how can we address some of the challenges of how we optimally spend our money on putting culture. Having said that, I'm going to shut up and let it go.
Hi, everyone. So as Roger said, my name is Alex Marquette, and I'm a PhD student here at VIMS and I'm part of the project that was recently funded through the Fisheries Improvement Fund. So this is, again, focusing on Virginia oyster fishery and management decision tool. So a little bit of background. I know you guys are very familiar with oysters and the fact that they have a wacky and weird and wonderful life history. So they spend that early portion of their life up in the water column floating around before they settle onto hard surfaces. These are typically other oysters is what we think of. And this puts an interesting management challenge where we're not just looking at the number of individuals out in the environment, but also the amount of shell that is available for them to settle on and grow. So there's this balancing act between the settlement, growth, and accumulation of oysters and the reef, and that has to be more than what we end up losing through things like burial, sedimentation, and take from the fishery itself. So our project is trying to get at a couple key goals of understanding both the biological and economic impacts of replenishment, since that is one of the major restoration tools that we use here in Virginia and lots of other oyster reefs throughout the East Coast. And the ultimate goal is to take our findings and then be able to develop a decision tool that incorporates both costs, risks, and outcomes that can be used by you to inform how you manage here in Virginia. So we've chosen to focus on the Rappahannock River for a few different reasons. The first is that there's substantial oyster habitat here. So about 22% of the bottom is considered to be suitable for oysters. And in 2007, as was mentioned, they initiated the rotational management scheme, having 2 of those areas open and then on that 3-year rotation. Additionally, it's relatively self-contained. So typically oysters that are harvested in the Rappahannock are landed in the Rappahannock. And it has a bunch of long-term monitoring that has been done in this river in particular. So the goal is to pull in a bunch of this long-term data to be able to understand how replenishment works in this river and then create that decision tool. So I'm going to walk through some of the long-term data sets and some of the preliminary analysis that we have planned and some exploratory figures. And then I have some questions for you guys at the end to make sure that the project that we have planned is actually going to answer the questions that you have in mind and be useful for you. So the first data set that we're going to be using is from the Patentong survey, which was already mentioned by Roger. So this was started in 1993 and happens annually in the fall and covers over 50 reefs in the Rappahannock River. And from that, we get a bunch of information on the abundance and density of oysters, their sizes. We can break them into size classes for spat, smalls, and market-sized oysters, the volume of shell that's available on the bottom, as well as the bottom type. The second data focuses on repletion. And so the replenishment efforts have been tracked and monitored by the MRC for the past several decades. So we have information on the locations, the volume, the type of material that was put down, the source of that material, if it was seed that was moved from one area to another is often available, but not always, as well as the cost of that replenishment event whenever that season occurred. And then the last is harvest data. So in 2006, there was a switch going from buyer reports to harvester reports. And those are put in monthly. And of course, as you guys are familiar with, we get information on the daily harvest, gear types, bushels that were harvested, the price that was got, and the area from which it came from. So the idea is to take all of these pieces and put them together to then understand how replenishment is impacting the reefs in these areas, and then what those economic and biological outcomes are. And then to, again, create that decision tool. So we have a couple of kind of proposed analyses. We're going to focus on that 2007 to 2021 period, in part because that's when rotational management change occurred. The other is that was a year after the shift to the harvester reports coming from the harvesters, and is also past a lot of those big zoonotic periods that we had in the Chesapeake Bay. So the first approach that we're going to use is called a production frontier, and it describes inputs and outputs. So for example, we have this figure here at the bottom. You have your replenishment on this bottom axis. So that's whatever you're putting in. That can be your shell volume that you're adding to those reefs, the costs. And then this upper axis is your objective. So ideally, this is going to be more oysters that are harvested in marketable size. So you can have all these different replenishment events out in the river and then create a production frontier. So this is essentially the edge that is giving you what is the most efficient replenishment. So ones that are on that curve are all equally efficient. So for what amount of replenishment you're putting in, you're getting the maximum amount of oysters out that you think that you could. If it's within that line, it means it's less efficient. So by doing this, we can actually look at the different conditions of each of those replenishments. So what material was used, how much the volume was, and try to figure out what is going to be the most successful in the Rappahannock River. The second approach is a modeling exercise. So we're going to be comparing sites that are paired, either locations that did, reefs that did or did not receive replenishment, and look at changes in oysters that way, or looking at before and after replenishment. And so one of the questions that will come at the end is thinking about which of these reefs are going to be most similar and would be good candidates for comparisons. And then ultimately all the outcome goes into a decision tool at the end that is meant to be user-friendly and available for you to help make decisions on how you deal with replenishment in the Chesapeake Bay, and how and when and what you choose to move between different areas. So as part of this, I've started doing a bunch of the data cleaning and joining these data sets together to look at changes in both spat, smalls, and market-sized oysters following replenishment events in the Rappahannock River. So I'm going to start with just spat and seeing how this changes. So we have years post-replenishment here on the bottom. So year 0 is the year that the replenishment happened. And then we have the oyster density of spat up here on the x-axis. So what we end up finding is that after that replenishment event occurs, you put shell or substrate out on the bottom, you end up seeing that we get lots and lots of juvenile oysters, which is great. Especially some of these really high points are in recent years where we've had those record level spat settlement events. The one problem is because they're so large, you can't see what any of these little box plots are at the bottom, which is kind of a useful part. So if we zoom in, this x-axis now only goes to 100 spat per meter on the bottom. And we end up seeing that when this replenishment event goes in, we end up having on average higher spat, and then it decreases over time. So this is really just showing that the replenishment event is actually being successful. So we're seeing that oysters are colonizing that shell that has been added to the reef, which is exactly what we would want. looking at these small sub-legal sized oysters, this is the same figure, but instead small oyster sizes, years post replenishment. We end up seeing that there's an increase over time to the second year, and we have the peak small oyster density in the second year. So we're seeing them grow out in the environment over time, which is great. For the market-sized oysters, it's a little bit of a different story where it goes up. And in the third year, we end up seeing, on average, higher densities of oysters, and then it declines after that, after those areas are open and available to harvest again. So this is showing that this rotation is actually working, which is really exciting. The thing that I found really exciting is that between that second and third year, after following the replenishment, there was actually a doubling in the available market-sized oysters on these reefs on average. So it went from about 6 market-sized oysters per meter to about 13 to 14 market-sized oysters per meter on the bottom of the Rappahannock River. And that's aggregated across all of those sites. So, in kind of guiding this project as we continue to go forward, this is still at the very early stages. The questions that I have for you guys are thinking about what kind of areas we should prioritize within the Rappahannock River or even outside of it. And based on your observations, are there times where replenishment has been really successful, and under what conditions have you seen that happen? Are there reefs that are similar that we could use as kind of paired sites where maybe they're in a similar location in the river and they seem to have similar environmental conditions? And then lastly, if we create a decision tool, what features in that would be the most important to you?
Just a few simple questions.
Yeah, I know. No pressure.
Was all of them examples taken off the reefs? I say all your examples say you give was taken off the reefs in the Rappahannock?
Yes, all of these are just from the Rappahannock River.
Just off the reefs?
Yes. Yes.
Just off the reefs that we survey.
The ones that we
Yeah,
surveyed.
well, I say they never worked. That's what survey that.
No, this is all the harvest.
Harvest area.
These are the harvest areas.
Yeah.
Oh, I thought
Yeah,
you
no,
said
no.
it was all off the reefs.
Yeah, no, see, he's saying reefs, he's talking about the sanctuary reefs.
Oh, no,
Right.
these are all the
I was
harvest
gonna
areas.
say, there's no way you can
Yeah.
do that. It's never worked.
I mean, one of the niceties that stands out to this, and actually the way it's plotted doesn't really show it that strongly, is that as you follow these over time, as we'd expect, we can get this progression from spat to the smalls to the markets. When you actually go in and look at the numbers that are in that box, and you don't want numbers because there are just tons and tons of them. The numbers of market oysters that you have out there in certain places, I mean, you look at some of those numbers, you're getting 50 a square meter. I mean, where you've done this and it's really worked, and you've left it alone, you get lots and lots and lots of market oysters. And if you back that off from year 3 to year 2 to year 1, the numbers that are in that band of 50 to 100 just disappears. I'm not picking on it, but when Tommy said we should do this every 3 years, he chose a magic number, and that really works well. And one of the things that I would really implore you to do is not mess with that, because those numbers are stark when you actually sit and you look at them all. The number of spaces out there where you get those high densities of oysters in the third year, that's when you want to harvest them. If you go a year before it, you're going to lose all that.
Can you put those questions?
What happens, could you go back to that again?
This one.
No,
One more. Cool.
Yeah, so what happens if you start just talking out about, when we said 3 years, it took 3 years for us to get anything to live at that point in time. What happens if you go lower amounts of time? I mean, what's an average, 6 weeks probably on a harvest in an area now?
Depends how long an area is open. In the Rappahannock, it's been 8 weeks.
Okay.
In area 2, the extension, it was
I
almost.
say that the last 2 years, we did area 8
7,
on 1 month.
For 1 month.
Yeah, and that's sort of where I was going. I mean, in my
It worked pretty
opinion,
good.
staff has been extremely successful in the 7-8 thing. And that's sort of what those numbers look like if we only go for 2 weeks in 4 areas instead of 8 weeks in.
Well, the question I would ask around the response to that is, first of all, when you look at these numbers, they actually even face like a 2x4. The second one is, how well can you cull this stuff out so that you put everything else back? And this
That's
is
a
one.
question for law enforcement.
Well, it isn't. I mean, I've spent days on dredge boats and I've spent days on patent hull boats. I am not an expert on either. But the challenge that you have if you want to go in and remove what is essentially the biggest ones in a group that just squeak into the market size is, can you put all the other stuff back without damaging it so that it'll grow? And at the moment, essentially, you don't have that problem if you close it for 3 years.
Well, let me ask you
I
something.
mean, Maryland and our private ground, we do that.
I understand that
Every
for
year.
closing it for 3 years.
Yeah.
But on the last day, I was at the dock at 8 o'clock. How many market oysters in that next 3 years? They're gonna all be dead.
That's it. When the
That's
next
what I'm
season,
trying to tell you. I was at the dock at 8 o'clock.
they agree the next season on my waterman talk about the 3 years rotation. The first thing they tell me on that first day is how many dead big oysters there are.
Yeah, all of them gonna be dead.
So it's like that third year, we lose a year of harvest or some part.
Dr. Rogers, something I'm a waterman in the James River
Sure.
mainly, something we use because there's so many oysters.
And by the way, Roger.
Good enough. When you make a tong lick, when you make a dredge grab or a patent tong lick, there's 300 oysters on the board. We call it picking the best and raking the rest because you have so many oysters in front of you. You pick the single ones up that you don't have to touch because you can throw them right in the basket. So everything else is gently moved back into the water. If you have something with a spat on it, it doesn't make sense to spend 2 or 3 seconds on it because there's someone right next to it that you can grab, put in the basket. And I can't speak for other boats, but I have a lot of friends that do the same thing.
Well, you know, I'm not going to argue with you about the fact that there's stuff left. If you have a really good year and it's not all harvested, there will be stuff left. And actually what that tells me is
What I'm
that.
saying is, sometimes you need, y'all put all these rules of like 3 years. Sometimes you gotta use a little judgment.
Well, I think.
This rock looked real good, like area 2.
Yeah.
We worked on that 3 months this year. And I don't know if I'm right or not, but I would say the last boat was at the dock at 10:30, the last day.
Yeah. So
And it was 70 boats out.
Yeah. Well,
Them oysters that you leave 3 more years from now ain't gonna be there.
I can see that. Isn't that a sign of great success that we actually have got more damn
Yeah, well, I
oysters than
seen
we
the
know what to
same
do
thing
with?
back in the 70s.
Oh,
You
you
see
would.
what happened.
Yeah, that was disease.
I was catching 60 bushels a day and went back the next year and couldn't catch enough to eat.
To the point, the whole conversation, the reason
And that's
I
what's
even
gonna happen
talked
again.
about it, I think this is a moving situation that we've tried to, what we came up with when we sat in that room.
Yeah.
And I mean, let's be realistic. We sat there in that whole Lawson's Bay area that's off limits now. Jim said, well, I think I would feel better for the first 3 years if we set this aside. And then all of a sudden, 6 years later, well, the Corps did some work over here on Mosquito Point. So we'll talk about that later. And so it's all success that we're even here, but I don't know that we can ever say that 2 years, 3 years, or 6 years.
I think it should go year to year.
That you've got to, look at the stock, look at the survey, and I'm not being critical because I think it's awesome. We can sit here. You go to Maryland, they don't have a survey like these guys do, and the amount of work that goes into that. They can't even have this conversation. All they do is open it every year and go catch what you can catch, and we'll deal with next year. So
the crab survey will show you that. God damn, ain't no crabs. Everybody beat me up this year. I can't get them for them.
And just on a
Where'd they
survey-
come from?
On a survey note, I think we all agreed that this was probably gonna be the best season that we've ever had, based on our survey. In the last
What do you
35
mean,
years.
best season?
I mean, the best season we've had in 35 years.
Yeah,
based
I
on
was gonna
survey.
say it was better before that, because I used to catch 30, 35 bushels every day.
Well, I think.
Now it's 50.
But I guess the point is that I think our survey is showing that it was gonna be good, and it was good.
Yeah.
So I think that's sort of
And it's
where we
still
kind
good.
of.
And that's, I'm not arguing. I mean, don't take it that I'm arguing because again, I think it's relative to survey, whether your estimate of 20% of what's there, 100 is still relative to
You can't get
a
so
wreck
many.
shows.
You
I
can't
mean,
get from so many.
I think that the question that you asked though about this is a reasonable one. So if you want to do a forward projection of what you think is out there in terms of bushels, And I can remember once about 10 years ago asking Rob O'Reilly if I did that, would he make it public? And he told me to go sit in the corner. Because one of the problems that you have, if I was to tell you that you could go out there and catch 100,000 bushels, how would you do that? Would you have would you have a gold rush? Would you have a derby? How are you going to manage that in terms of access? That's one problem that you have. The other is this though, if you have this sort of thing and we can find this, then the debate is, are you going to manage these things almost day to day to day? So if it turns out that we do this survey in November and we come up with a number and we say, okay, there's going to be a very big year this year, are we going to get to the point where we're going back to the commission every month to say, this is where we are, have we got it, have we not got it? And that's a management problem as to how you do this. When I look at this data set, the thing that it just strikes me is just how well it works. And then the other side of it is, if you want to mess with it, what are you going to do to it? And those are the two things. And I understand where you're coming from. I'm leaving stuff on the bottom. If we go into a rather more open situation, are you going to mess it up? I don't know. You could try it and you might go backwards quite a few years, and then you're going to have to start all over again.
But if we managed our private ground that we set up what we were gonna do and left it for 20 years and never tweaked it and never talked about, I mean, what my private ground, they have the numbers, what my private ground is doing inshore of Area 4 almost mirrors what we're doing.
Yeah.
But I can't just leave it there for 3 years and never touch it. I mean, economically, I would be out of business. And
Let me tell you what his granddaddy told me when I was 18 years old. He said, if you see him, you better get him. He had all the oysters in the world on Archie Point and checked it and didn't get them and went back was gonna save them till spring and went back and they were all dead. Every one of them. He told me, if you ever see them, don't leave them.
Well, I think one of the things, trying to tie this conversation back in together and just want to put some more information out there, is sort of what Ryan touched on at the beginning, is one of the reasons that we're seeing as many oysters here today is because we didn't catch all the big oysters. They went through that life cycle, and sometimes they do die, and sometimes there's novel diseases. And if we do maximize number of market oysters that are harvested of all these areas, yes, we do have sanctuaries that make up for a part of that. I guess there's a couple of things. There's one, you're potentially harvesting oysters that are going to spawn and keep these areas going. Two, you're potentially harvesting oysters that might have developed some natural disease resistance to current diseases or new diseases. And sort of from a management perspective, we'll just stick with the Rappahannock, and these are rough numbers, and Alex is going to get into a lot more detail. But in the scrape areas, the last 3 years, we've planted roughly 300,000 bushels to get them to where they are in the 2022 survey. That's how many bushels roughly have gone in just to the scrape areas. And we've taken roughly in that same 3-year time period, 150,000 bushels out. So that's what we've had to do, sort of going back to maintain these areas and keep them getting better, is one, get good spat sets and put that level of shell planting to maintain these areas. That's on top of 30,000 bushels of seed that's gone into areas 6, 7, and 8 up the river to sort of get to where we were this last season. So we can definitely keep maximizing the fishery for maximum harvest by going to a 2-year rotation in certain areas. But all of that maximum harvest is maintained by maintaining our replenishment effort at its current levels, which we can do for 10 years, 15 years, maybe longer. But at some point, costs are going to get so much, shell's not going to be available, that we're going to have to make that shift, or we're going to have to manage things differently. So that's just something to put out there. And just as some other examples, area 2, we can get into this later. We had our shell volume drop from 12 liters per square meter down to less than 6, based on the extension of that harvest effort. So that was an area that is now going to need replenishment effort. Area 4, not quite as bad. We closed that area early. But again, our shell volume dropped below 10, and half the markets are gone and half the spat are gone. So these are things that you have to take into account on these more rotations. And definitely I agree with Tommy that a shorter rotation is going to be less impactful if it's a 1 month versus a 2 month. versus the 3 months, it's definitely gonna be more, and your apples to apples comparison is important. But I think looking at Alex's work, sort of what are we getting out in terms of the amount of bushels, the volume of brown shell that we're losing versus what we're getting in, and sort of getting that balance going forward is gonna be the most important thing. And the markets are gonna go up and down based on a lot on spat set. There's gonna be some natural mortality, there's gonna be fresh hits that are gonna come in there. But if we're managing that shell base, it's gonna go up and down, but it's not gonna crash. And hopefully other areas will be stable, and that's what will go along. But if we get too much too quickly, 3 years it'll be okay. 6 years we'll know if we got it terribly wrong, and it could go down quick. Those are sort of what we see with these 3-year timeframes if we lose that shell base, looking at the long-term data. But that's just some more information, sort of overshot of what's going on. Try to tie this together for the discussion, which nicely tied right into what we're talking about now.
Could we take an area and see if we're over replenishing, do nothing? I mean, no one here has got any more at stake with an area 2 or area 4. Let's not do anything replenishment wise and see what.
I say Lawson Bay would be a good place.
Well, I think this goes back to Alex's question. We find 2 areas that are pretty similar, close to one another, where we do replenish one and another one not. Because, you know, the conversation that you just had has 2 parts. It's the number of oysters that go out. It's the number of dollars that go in. And if we can do exactly that, something, if you go back through all the replenishment information, you know, I sat through most of those conversations and they were very ordered in terms of, we need to put some shell here, or we need to put some there. But actually what we haven't done is actually talked about how many dollars we spent going in and dollars we spent going out. And precisely this debate, we've worked on this 10 liters per square meter base, and then we keep coming back up to it. It has good sense in the biology, and if you look at all of his data, you can plot it. You can see above this, you get good spat set, and below it, it gets really fuzzy. But if you want to try an area of no repletion versus repletion, and we can get 2 close together, you can do that. And then you can ask, you know, dollars in, dollars out, a couple of years down the line. You've got enough space out there to do it. It's just that, you know, we need from you guys some suggestions as to where we can do it.
I mean, private industry, you know, I couldn't afford to do replenishment at the levels that the Commonwealth's able to do it.
Yeah.
And you compare some, I mean, I know that the whole poaching thing comes up. Andrew knows, there's several know that in the areas that, and the numbers that come off some of our areas, they're not poached. It's real. They see me planting the shell and that sort of thing. So
yeah.
I'm just asking the question, is there such thing as over replenishment?
And the question I had about, you're saying it's 300K planted and 150K out. In other words, financially, it's a half, get back half on your investment?
That was bushels of shell. So, I mean, basically, most areas that are dredged or scraped, you know, if we're doing our seed program, Yank Tank, Grape Comico, 2 bushels of shell back for every 1 bushel removed is about the ratio that we do it when we're maintaining one of these seed areas. But that's what's been going into the scrape areas in the Rappahannock the last 3 years. Basically, 2 bushels of shell for every 1 bushel of oysters caught to maintain it and to get that population to where it is now.
You know, we had that, we had a 3-year rotation we have now in Rappahannock. And one thing I want to thank, you know, people I talk to always say how Virginia does a great job. We have one of the best years. Well, one thing we have is between industry, BIMS, and BMRC, we work together. That's a plus. And I want to thank all of y'all for that. But I think remember years ago, you guys remember when had areas open in Rappahannock, it was the only area open. There'd be 200 and some boats on it. And then 3 years that would work. But right now, with Andrew and staff, we got it spread out through the whole bay. So it's not quite getting just, you know, damaged right off the bat like it used to be. So that's another thing to take in consideration of going to a 2-year rotation.
Well, I think that it comes back to this bigger question that Tommy talked to about 15 minutes ago. Where are you going with this? I mean, I just look at the oysters. You guys are looking at who's going to harvest it. So if you've got 200 boats spread out, if 15 years from now, you're gonna end up with 50 boats because all the old guys retired, how's this gonna work? I mean, he's gonna go out of business other than what he does off his private grounds, and the public harvest is gonna be what? You know, and what are we planning for? And one of the reasons why we're sort of intrigued by this is, if you're putting down 2 bushels of shell to get 1 bushel of oysters out, you're burning shell at this point in time. Economically, I would suspect that doesn't make sense. And one of the things that we're trying to do by looking at all the past records is to actually come out with that. And then I know he's going to tell me he's not very good at doing it. That's all right.
No, I wouldn't say that.
But, well, there are better ways of doing it. But the point is that as we sort of try to develop an optimum management approach to the shell, where we've got now, where we have at least some stable spat set and we can look at it. If you're trying to sort of project forward 10, 15, 20 years, and you want to set yourself a goal.
Might not be here.
Well, you won't,
Yeah.
and I probably won't. But the point is if we want an, I mean, he's got a son who's going to pass his
Somebody
stuff.
presses that red button, ain't nobody gonna be here.
Well, you know,
Dr. Carlos here.
if we all worry about that, we should all go home and get a good bottle of malt and just sit with that.
I think you better start wearing it.
But I think when you look at it in the longer term, the questions become, where are you going to get your shell from? The state of Maryland's been struggling with that for a while. If we've got a limited resource, how's the best way to use it? And this is part of that debate about how the best way to use it. If the way in which we do repletion, there's an optimal way, but it's different to the way in which you do it. But you do it as a private planter, and you control access and harvest from the point of a private planter, which is different to the problem of controlling access when you have a public fishery. And so you have all of these different pieces, which are apples and oranges, and you're never going to change it. But if in the end, if we have a target, 10, 15, 20 years out, we want to be at 500,000 bushels a year, given all the pieces that we've got, the changing number of people, the age of the people, the limited amount of shell, the options that you have to manage private areas, and God forbid that I should suggest that we actually change the way in which we manage Baylor. I mean, that gets me lynched. I mean, if you look at all of this realistically, we haven't got to that part of the conversation yet. And yet I think that's the conversation that you say we really need to have.
Andrew, we talk about maximizing harvest. If say someone came to you and the staff next year and said, I want a 800,000 bushel public harvest. We're sort of bookend on the season, which is a good thing. And I love this idea of, setting a season, coming back halfway through and redoing it. But if someone told you I wanted an 800,000 bushel harvest, how would we even do it? How would, with the amount of watermen and the limits, keeping the limits the same and the things that we're doing as far as, how would we even grow this fishery much beyond what it is with the amount of effort that we've got to catch the resource?
Tommy, I have a question for you. When you say the season is bookended, what do you mean by that? You mean it's
So by code, we can't open until October 1st, and was it April 31st that we've got to close? So we're there. And then staff is able and SMAC's able to work seasons in that.
okay.
But, when we talk about maximizing harvest, I'm not in favor of my 2 cents worth of just saying, let's go see how many we can catch and maximize. But aren't we on the upper end of what we can do?
And is there a market, Tommy? That's another
No.
question. There's not a market for more,
No.
800,000 bushels.
Well, I think, to Tommy's point, what we've seen over the last 6 years, for example, is that with our current replenishment effort and our current harvest effort bouncing, in that 200 to 300,000 bushel range, with 300,000 being the top end, that once we started getting over that 300,000 bushel range, that's when we started initiating the limited entry. We started to see that resource go the wrong way. So we're probably at the top end of where we've been at least in the last 6 years. And unless things change drastically, we went to 800,000 bushel season, we'd probably be having discussions about limiting that shortly thereafter. So probably 3 years after we went that high, we go, we're in trouble. If we went that high that quickly, we'd probably be maybe even quicker in that trouble. We could have an 800,000 bushel season next year if we wanted to. There's that many oysters out there. There's more than enough, but you probably couldn't do that 3 years in a row. And if you tried to do it for 3 years in a row, you might be able to do it for 3 years in a row. But after 6 years, you go, well, we're out of shell now. We're out of oysters. It's gonna take 20 years for it to come back.
With the parameters we have and the number of licenses that we have, and you may not be able to answer this, could we even harvest very many more than what we're doing with the existing?
Not unless the latent license, but we've got a lot of people that buy a license that are not working. It's probably around 300 people, I think, Andrew?
Yeah, roughly. I mean, there's about 400 boats working.
Yeah, they
Or
would have,
300 to
700
350
licenses, so something like that. Yeah, so they would have to go to work.
Most of them's got 2 head on though.
Right. So I mean, it's roughly,
You're talking about 600 instead of 300.
Right.
And I apologize for getting so, because I mean, this is wonderful what, you know, and I think you've hit exactly where I wanted to be with this whole Rappahannock thing. And the point, if you go back to what Vernon, I don't know if he's still here. If you went back to what Vernon and I, this conversation in 2008 would look way different than what it's looking now. But it's just, we're not going to answer these questions today. And I'm not trying to open up Pandora's box. I'm just saying, could we look at our rotation in the Rappahannock? And I just have a real issue with these 3-inch oysters, 3.5-inch oysters. How many of them are dead when we go back on that 3rd year? That's my whole premise for this. And, you know, Andrew and I agree on a lot. We don't agree on a lot. He'll say we've got the shell. When my thing is, when, you know, all the years that we've gone to the General Assembly and begged money to increase the replenishment program, to increase staff, to increase dollars and so forth, it's always been based on economics. That, you know, the environmental groups in the last 2 administrations did an awesome job and were able to get a lot of replenishment or restoration money. But, you know, what started this program was the dollars it was going to generate. And to me, a bushel of 3.5-inch market oysters is a lot more valuable than a bushel of shell. And
well, I think the only way you get to where you are is, for want of a better fancy term, adaptive management. So you go in and you open up on October, we have some idea as to what's out there. We finish our surveys hopefully before Thanksgiving. And then the question becomes, you start looking at the landings. If everybody's still getting back to the dock before 9 o'clock at their limit, and there's still lots out there, and then the question becomes, okay, what else is out there based upon the landings that keep coming in and the survey that suggested, you know, if you were going to close on the last day in November, maybe you should give another 4 weeks. And I think once you get into this debate about how do you manage a fishery by this conversation, there's nothing wrong with managing. It just gets to be a bit difficult to do it because you never quite know where you are. You can do these sorts of surveys and you can look at this sort of information. I think the real question is do you have the resources to do it? And at least from our perspective, we start sufficiently late in the year so that we can get the spat. There's no point in us starting to do a survey in August because we missed the end of the spat set. So if you look at all of those measurement things, we like to be able to measure them so we can get a good idea of what the spat set is in terms of measurements. So we don't start typically until, you know, October-ish. And then the problem that you have is the weather gets worse and worse and worse. And trying to do this stuff out there when it's snowing, you've all been out there, it's pretty miserable trying to do that. The next
So this year.
yeah, and so when you try, so we have this small time window, and we are much better now than we were 5 years ago, in part because of what this lady and that fellow have done in terms of collecting our data to the point where instead of piles of paper, literally when she comes back to the dock, she plugs into the modem, and the data is 20 feet away the next morning. And one of the things that we continue to try to do is to get from there to the point where we can get effectively those graphs out by the end of the day. We haven't quite got there yet. But then when you come to the question, if you'd have asked me this question 5 years ago, I'd have said, Tommy, I just can't do it. Now, it's not that I can say that I can do it now, but the idea of asking me an adaptive management thing, which is what other fisheries do, it's not completely bonkers. It's not something that I think is easy, but I do think it is something that you could have a rational conversation about, where instead of this gentleman saying, you know, I'm back at the dock with it, you know, I've got my limit, there's stuff out there, and I'm saying, I'm sorry, I haven't finished the surveys yet, so I can't tell you what it, you know, that's not where we should be. But we should be at the point where we could have these conversations, and especially if we want to do it in terms of the context of replenishment, non-replenishment, what's optimal replenishment, and we drive it by the number of dollars that we put in. I think there's options for lots of interesting conversations about how we do it. It's just practically how you do it.
And I mean, with all due respect, I mean, I don't need a stock assessment in 2007 when the guys had a 6 bushel limit and they worked until 2 o'clock and at the end of 4 weeks couldn't catch it.
Yeah.
Versus a 16 bushel limit and then at the dock by 9:30, I've got, that's how much this has changed. And
Don't you think it would be a good idea though to have these questions be sent out to the whole committee and have an opportunity to think about this a little bit?
that's a wonderful idea. If
Have these questions sent
if
out.
Alex is, open, I think that's a,
That's why she's here today, to interrogate you.
Well, if we can have them sent out, Andrew. to
Yeah,
the
no,
whole
absolutely.
committee, And then,
The only thing is that I tell you, that once you get into this conversation, you're gonna be here for another 2 or 3 years, you're never gonna get out of it. And to turn your cell phone
no,
off.
I
or
think
else
you
you'll be
put them
calling
back up again, can you do
Oh,
that?
yeah.
and,
I
and
think
I, you know,
particularly the last one, the most important features for a decision tool, why would she work on anything if we weren't interested in what the outcome was? Why would you work on a decision tool if the industry can do it your way?
well, this just to me, I'm thinking not for JC or Ernie or myself, or maybe even down to Ben, but for the ones behind us, a 15-year strategic. And while, someone in Andrew's position, he could take that economic number. If you had the wrong guy in Andrew's job, he could drive that economic number to the point that you'd never say it makes sense. You could do enough replenishment and you could bring the harvest down to a point that it could cost you, 200 to 1 replenishment versus what you're getting back. So, I just would like to see us do something strategically that lasts years and do it in a fashion, when we set this thing up 20 years ago, if at the end of the day, everyone decides, well, it just needs to stay like that for the next 100 years, so be it. But
Well, the thing that's interesting to me is when we talked about it before the meeting started, and I saw it this summer, my way, there were so many crabs that the crabbers, the price just bottomed out almost within 2 weeks or 3 weeks after they started. And it wasn't worth going out there. It wasn't, they quit. They pulled their pot. They said, I'm not gonna do this kind of labor, spend this kind of gas money, spend this kind of, all this kind of stuff. When I can't sell them, there's no picking houses. That's another whole issue. Why would you want to have oysters that you can't market? If you had, doesn't it drive the price down just like it does crabs?
well, it does, and we've been very, very fortunate that, I take it the good Lord's done it, but our resource came back at the most optimal time for the market. If this resource had come back as strongly as it has 10 years ago, the boats wouldn't have worked 2 days a week.
No, they wouldn't.
It wouldn't have, it is timed perfectly with,
They're gonna come back eventually.
You will come back, it always did.
they're there. It's just a matter of,
So that's another.
And they're gonna leave just like they came back.
but does a strategic strategy make sense? I guess I'm not looking for something that we're automatically just gonna put into effect for next season, or that you've got to decide today, but start thinking something that's looking on out towards the end of your career, or You know, but in a fashion that we change as we go, not that we just say, okay, let's have a 3-year rotation in 19, and we started having that discussion, I guess, in 03 or 04 or whatever. And that's the way it's gonna be forever type thing.
And I think what Tommy is saying is it's not unique to oysters. This is something that's struggled with across a whole bunch of fisheries. Is we look at the harvest, we look at the surveys, we look at our neighbors and who's on the water, and we react year to year, 2 years to 2 years. We're like, you know, how am I gonna make my house payment next year? How am I gonna do this? And we react. A lot of fisheries struggle with what is this going to look like 10 years from now? What do we do now that's inherently good for the fishery that is going to benefit us 10 years from now? And those are harder discussions because they're not as specific, because we don't have that year-to-year data that says what we're going to do for 10 years. But if we know we need to replace younger people, that's not something we can do in a year. That's a 10-year strategic plan.
Right,
If we need to increase markets, if we can't handle 800,000 bushels,
that's what you did.
but we need to increase markets, that's a 10-year plan. If we don't have the infrastructure, whether it be, you know, you can look at a fishery like the flounder fishery right now. When we have failing markets where people can't dock their boats, they can't get into Chincoteague Bay anymore. Those are 10-year problems that we need to think about. So I think those are the things that Tommy's really getting at, is we want to be in a better place 10 years versus our reactionary kind of methods to what Roger provides, what we have harvest data, and what we're seeing on the water.
And that's what I want to give you credit for too, is working on that marketing strategy with the work that you did with the supermarkets and the opportunities that there were to have a place for oysters to go to. And that's really important too, long term.
And I'll say sort of as you know, thinking about it, I'm one of the relatively younger people in this room, despite what my hairline might say. You know, I plan on being around for at least 20 something years, and my sort of stated goal is I'd like there to be at least a fishery as good as it is now, 10 years and 20 years from now. So I think that's sort of a baseline, is let's not mess it up too bad 10 years from now, and incremental increases. So I think that's something to look at in terms of that perspective. And a couple
That makes
things.
perfect sense.
And it's also,
But we have to stay in business during the process,
and
right?
it's also a balance between
And
an agency that's charged with the whole purpose of the Virginia Marine Resources Commission is to fumigate seafood, right?
That's to maintain the natural resources for present and future generations.
That's right. And we have to balance the regulatory things we do with that mission. Because sometimes those don't get in the same place.
And one more thing on the time perspective is the fossil shells that we're working with, that resource took 10,000 years to get to where it is now. So that's how long it's taken to get to the shells that we're gonna go through. And if you go all the way back to when we started, about 100 years maybe. So that's sort of what we're doing now to maintain this fishery. Took 10,000 years to create, and it'll be gone in 100. So just sort of, and that won't come back easily. So that's something to sort of keep in terms of the
How long do you
perspective.
project the amount of shells where it's at now, Andrew? How long it's gonna last?
Where we're currently working, 10 to 15 years.
Well, hasn't there been any increase in everywhere I go, I get shells, and we're all saving shells. We're not throwing them away. We're not putting them in the landfill anymore. Is that not making any impact?
Well, it does, but I guess the shell recycling programs, like the ones in Lynnhaven River, that area, I mean, they're producing thousands. Jackie might know. I mean,
We did 3,000 bushels a year.
and
That's
we're
a lot of
planning.
effort.
We put that much on 3 acres.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it runs our stat on shell, but it would never build reefs
Yeah,
or
right.
replenish, unfortunately.
And
But it was nothing.
it was definitely good. I mean,
Oh, yeah, we used to buy shells and we don't buy them anymore, so that's good.
And then that's the balance for long-term sustainability. If Andrew says we have 10 to 15 years of fossil dredge shell, well, then we need to think 10 to 15 years out. If we don't have that dredge shell, fossil shell available, how do we replenish this? Do we manage them in a way that we don't need to replenish? Do we look at 2 years? Do we look at 3 years? What are the other options? And that doesn't take reactionary year to year. That's a 10-year plan that I believe Tommy's trying to get at is taking that into effect and taking the markets, taking the age of the watermen. And we want to look back and be, hey, 10 years, it's still a great fishery from what we are now. And if we don't look at those things, we just ignore them and worry about season extensions and worry about where we're going to put and where our next dollar is going to come from, then we're going to lose that over the next 10 years. So even it's the opportunity to sit down in a group like this. This is nice having it at VIMS. It's kind of a more informal where we can all sit down as a group. We're not actually making any management decisions today, which is nice, but getting the right people in the right room at the right time to be able to think about those things is kind of the goal.
And honestly, that's where it all started. In a setting just like this, that was a lot harsher. But
Think we'll have some drinks next time.
We got a great patio for it.
Can I ask a question? What would be the appetite for an alternative substrate to replenish with, or is that even possible? I know you've done some experiments, might not be cost effective, but if we don't have shells, we need to think about.
You need to incentivize the shells.
Right.
It isn't, there's nothing like a shell.
There's
just
not, but there are a lot of companies that can use some amount of calcium carbonate with other things, and I know gets into. Anyway, just, the people that are harvesting.
Gravel did a good job, I thought.
Yeah, no, I think that's definitely gonna be I don't wanna take up too much more time diving into alternative substrates. We could talk about that too next go around, but just quickly, definitely gonna be a tool going forward on harvest areas. It's something that talking to the harvesters of working area too, a lot of that was on small stone chips and works very well. The real limitation is just the good area that's suitable for oysters that can support that. So a lot of the areas that we can plant with shell just aren't quite hard enough to support that gravel, but we can use gravel more in areas and sort of save our more limited shell for those softer areas that are still good bottom. So that's definitely going to be a component going forward. And again, it's one of those funding things is right now we have enough funding to do the shell program on harvest areas. But if we start doing shell and alternative substrate, then we're potentially missing some areas that could use shell and need shell. So that's one of those things going forward that we're going to have to figure out the balance of.
And we need to also keep in mind what we want to put in our rivers and
Clean ground concrete is all VMRC currently uses in our alternative substrate program.
I'm just real sensitive to that because I wonder why.
and another thing with the shell, we're not gonna fix it. It's a good thing. Rich will tell you. I mean, when his grandfather, or when we, first came along, everything got shot, and the shell stayed in Virginia, and the oyster meats went out of state. Well, now, the half shells
40% of my business.
a bigger, almost or approaching the shucking component. And when you send shell oysters, I mean, it's a novel idea, but when you send them to Indianapolis, they're not coming back to the
You
bay.
don't send them a return order box.
Is that what that is?
Yeah.
They keep going up. We might have to do that, but
If you look at the Louisiana lease fishery, it's almost entirely run on granite that's actually barged down from Kentucky. And it works because if you've ever seen their barges, they are absolutely enormous. You look at the oysters that come out before the Army Corps killed them all by diverting all the water. But you have oysters this big and you find chips of granite on them. Now, again, if you're going to shuck them, that's one thing. With all due respect to our friends in Louisiana, they're not the prettiest oyster when they serve them up on a plate. So, there are alternatives that are well established, but just the scale of that. So say you wanted to get a barge of granite in here, where the hell would it come from and what would it cost you? So part of the problem that you have is the other side of it. They can work on giant scales, and so stuff comes 1,000 miles. We can't do that in terms of costs here, and that's why this sort of approach, when you come back to how much money do you spend on the inside and how much you get out, we haven't quite worked that out yet. We need to optimize that.
Did we answer any of your questions?
Not really, but you can email me if you'd like
started
to
a heck of a
provide.
discussion.
I think the thing to do, Alex, is that, and we've got the complete list of everybody. Let's take these and put them into a simple one page. Can you answer the question? Do as the lady says. Let's spread it around and see what people's opinions are, because you have not only opinions, you have literally hundreds of years worth of experience in here. And, you know, the gentlemen who work out on the water are people like Tommy and Lake Howard and others who've been in this business for a long time. And they can give you this broad aspect of it.
All right, so that brings us to our final agenda item, which is discussion on changes to the current rotational harvest strategy of the Rappahannock. Just getting there, but I think we just did that, so, unless there's any other items or, agenda items, I think, thank you again, Roger, and Missy, and Ryan, and Alex, and Andrew for hosting us here, and, turn it over to JC.
Motion to adjourn?
I will say that you're welcome to come back and do this here anytime. I don't know how much it improves or makes it worse for any of you in terms of where you have to drive. But there is one thing in here is we don't have an us and them sitting where we do. And we are allowed to rearrange all the tables in here, which is why they're on. So this purpose about having a round table or a square